Hi and welcome, and let's talk about money and leadership. Yes, welcome to On the Cube Leadership Podcast, where we look at everyday events and learn how we can become better leaders from the lessons we can learn from those things that are happening in current news. Today's podcast is going to be slightly different because we normally just take metaphors, but there's some really crucial things we need to know about money right now. There's a lot of things that are happening with what's happening with the US dollar. It's no longer the central currency of the world, or it's shifting away from, and what's happening with crypto. And hang on a second, there's a central bank digital currency happening, and there's all these things happening. In Australia, the RBA, the main bank, the central bank in Australia, it has the Reserve Bank. That was the word that I was looking for. Reserve Bank of Australia. They're doing a bit of an overhaul. There is so much happening with money right now. And so, yes, there's a lot of leadership lessons we can learn as leaders, but I also feel it's very, very, very crucial for us as leaders to actually know what's happening with money in the world. Some of these topics are very, very crucial for us to know as leaders. And so, why not, with my co-host being a doctor of economy, and why not gain from his knowledge and draw from his knowledge and experience and see what we can learn from these things happening. Dr. Rod St. Hill, welcome. Not only are you an economist, you are my pastor and the business pastor. Welcome once again.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Craig, as always, and this time after a little break.
Yes, we had a bit of. You went away on a pastors conference. I was going to say retreat. It wasn't a pastors conference last week. I hope you've refilled from that.
Oh, it was absolutely fantastic. It was great.
Great.
Best ever.
Great.
Best ever.
Awesome. Love having you back. It's always good. First leadership lesson of the day. You have to take time away, and also you have to take time to go and get filled, which if you're watching this podcast, or listening to this podcast, you're doing that. So well done. Let's get straight into it. And there was this article by Global Times, and it's been in the news for the last week or so, about the de-dollarization of the US dollar and the de-dollarization of it. But also this article said, but the de-weaponization of the dollar is actually more urgent. Dr. Rod, what are both of those terms and why are they important to us?
Well, you got to love the media, haven't you, for inventing new terms, tongue twisters at that. And
Yes.
Obviously, not too many people are going to understand what it's all about. They're new words. And, you create a new language, you suddenly become an expert. So forgive me for being a little bit skeptical of what's going on in the media. But look, the two terms are a little bit similar because they are describing two things that are happening in the world today. De-dollarization, that really is about the reduction in the use of the US dollar for international trade purposes and also as holding as a foreign currency reserve. So every country that's involved in trade has to pay for their imports and to receive payments for their exports. And from about the end of the Second World War until fairly recently, the US dollar was the most popular currency in which to do trade. So countries paid for their imports using US dollars, and they received payment for their exports primarily using US dollars. There are some other fairly major currencies as well, including pounds, the pound sterling, and a few other currencies. Now, because countries pay for and receive payment for their exports in US dollars, they also have to hold reserves of US dollars. And that essentially is like a deposit in the, but it's held in terms of the US dollar.
And is that in a US bank that's
held in?
No,
it doesn't have to be. No, it doesn't have to be in a US bank. It can be anywhere, really. So what's been happening in recent years is that a number of countries have got together and they've come to agreement that instead of using the US dollar for their trade transactions, they will use some other currency.
Yep.
And some quite large economies, including China, India, Brazil, and a few others, have come to agreements to use their own currencies to settle their trading transactions with
Yep.
one another. And as a result, there's less demand now for United States dollars for the purposes of trade. And over the last 30, 40 years or so, the quantity of the world's reserves of foreign currencies held in US dollars has fallen from around 85% to just under 60%. So roughly a 25 percentage point reduction. Now, de-weaponization, on the other hand, that's a much more difficult concept to grasp. And I hope I'm beginning to understand it. But you will know that often when there is some dispute going on in the world, and the most recent example would be the war in Ukraine, the
Yep.
United States and sometimes the international organizations have led boycotts or restrictions on trade.
Mhm.
And in a sense, that means that the US dollar is being used as a weapon.
Yep.
So making it impossible for Russia, for example, to engage in payment for international trade using US dollars. That's weaponizing the US dollar in a sense.
Yeah, so
The problem,
explain that to me for a minute, because I understand that concept is US then took away their, like, Russia's
well, in
reserves,
a
or they,
sense,
like,
what you do is,
how did that work?
what you can do is freeze any US dollars that are held in US banks, for example, so that if governments or large corporations are holding US dollar deposits inside the United States, they can't use that money. So that's the sense in which the US dollar can be used as a weapon. Now, one of the problems in using the US dollar as a weapon is that it makes the United States dollar a less reliable currency in which to do international trade. So
Yeah.
those two are connected. And as nations see the dollar being used in a sense as a weapon, they are becoming more and more reluctant to use the US dollar to settle their international trade transactions because of the fear that they might not be able to use any reserves of US dollar currencies that they hold. So
Is that the only reason why they're they're moving towards this, like,
no, no,
de-dollarization? Or
no,
is
it's
it
not the
also
only.
because the American dollar is now kind of not as stable as it
Yeah,
used to
you're
be?
right. You're right. Um, and any currency is only useful in international trade if it itself has a stable value. That requires that the host nation, as it were, have a relatively low rate of inflation, which of course isn't the case at the moment. And
Yep.
there's no end in sight because the government is utterly incapable of restraining spending under the Biden
Mhm.
administration, and actually under really basically since the days of Reagan. The federal government in the United States has found it virtually impossible to seriously rein in spending. And so more and more dollars are literally printed. And that was particularly the case during COVID. And that must lead to inflation if the government is unwilling to rein in their own spending or to increase taxes.
Yep.
So that raises the issue of instability in the value of the US dollar. So it's less attractive. Now, interestingly enough, when the international monetary system was established after World War II, the British proposal was to actually establish a separate international currency, and that was to be used to settle international trade transactions. And part of it also would punish countries that run up large trade surpluses. Now, the Americans were against both. They wanted the US dollar to become the international currency, and they opposed the idea that countries that ran up large surpluses on their trading accounts should be punished for it. They rejected that idea. Now, the logic behind it was that if one or a few countries are recording very large surpluses on their international trade, that has to mean that there are other countries that are experiencing deficits on their trade.
Yeah.
Now, the system we ended up with, and you can blame America for this because they were obviously in a powerful political position after the Second World War, and they thought they were rigging the system in their favour. So they insisted on punishment for deficit nations, but not for surplus nations. And that's created all kinds of problems in the international monetary system, not the least of which is negative feelings of people in many of the low-income countries towards the United States and the higher-income countries in general, because they've had to make some very significant adjustments as they experienced chronic deficits on their international trading accounts. So, and ironically, the system has allowed countries like China to generate huge wealth by consistently running surpluses on their international trading accounts. So China has, in a sense, become very wealthy through the system that the United States established after the Second World War. It's really come back to bite them big time because it's allowed China now to have a massive influence throughout the world because they have built up such incredible economic power through consistently running trade surpluses. And there were no sanctions on China for doing that. There was pressure from time to time for them to make adjustments to the value of their currency in terms of US dollars and so on. But they really haven't been forced to do anything because the international monetary system, in a sense, benefits those who are running surpluses at the expense of those who are running deficits. Now, of course, the United States is running very large deficits on their trade accounts.
I'm gonna jump in for a second, Dr. Rob, because I thought I was following along, but now I don't think I am. This surplus and deficit idea. Can you talk me through a practical example? Like, give me two countries and how them. Deficit and surplus. What does that mean?
Well, if let's treat individual countries as if they're individual businesses for a moment.
Yep.
An individual business makes a profit by generating more income than it costs. All right. Mm-hmm. So the business has a surplus. We call that a profit. Now, when we're talking about two different countries that are trading together, a nation can generate income by selling goods and services overseas. But when it brings goods and services across its borders, that is what we call imports, it has to pay for them. Now, a country that is actually earning more by exporting goods and services than it is paying for the imports of goods and services, it runs a surplus.
So, let's talk about Australia and China, right? Australia, one of our big exports is, let's just go basics, iron ore, right? Like we export a lot of minerals. Let's just break it down to minerals.
Iron ore and coal.
Let's say we export $100 million worth of iron ore to China, but we import $200 million worth of electronics from China. That means we're in a $100 million deficit and they're in a $100 million surplus. Is that
that's right?
What it, yes,
that's how it works basically. And then you add that up across all of the countries around the world, and then you get a net surplus or a net deficit, and in some cases a balance. And
so it's not necessarily that they owe us the money or we owe them the money. It's not about who owes money. It's
not really about debt
who controls the resources.
It's more about surpluses and deficits than it is about debt. Although a country that consistently runs a trade deficit will actually be running up debt because it's going to have to borrow to pay for the deficit.
Yes.
Okay.
That makes sense.
And it works a little bit similarly to the way it does, say, for businesses or for individual households. Now, a country which has lots of resources and lots of potential for development, like Australia, can actually run a deficit on its trading accounts for a long time, and Australia has done that for years and years and years, because there's still lots of development opportunities in Australia. Similarly for the United States, but they are running such large deficits now that people are starting to wonder, well, for how much longer will people be willing to hold US dollars? In other words, for how much longer will the United States actually be able to borrow from overseas in order to pay for the difference between its exports and its imports?
Yeah. Okay. So let's bring this back to this de-dollarization thing. So you're saying this surplus and deficit is actually part of this de-dollarization, because that system was first set up in alignment with that dollarization system and making the US dollar the central currency to that?
Yes. After there was a meeting of mainly the victorious nations after the Second World War, and they met, among other things, to build a structure for international payments.
Yeah.
And the Americans had significant influence, and the ultimate agreement was essentially that the United States dollar would become the international currency. So as well as being the United States currency, it would also be the international currency.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, was a mistake. They would have been better off running with the system that was recommended by the British, who wanted to set up a separate international currency. And look, there have been some attempts since then to do that through the international monetary system, through a system of what we call special drawing rights that would take us into an area which is probably not necessary and is very, very complex. But suffice to say, the Americans wanted that dominance.
Mm-hmm.
They won the argument at the time. I think it's now coming back to bite them.
So I hear people obviously listening to a lot of American podcasts and especially conservative or Republicans on that side. They're fighting for this. They say that the US dollar being the central currency is the best thing since sliced bread and everything like that, because, and I've heard these arguments, because they can make these sanctions on people. They can. There has to be someone central. There has to be a good guy. That's kind of like what they say. There has to be a good guy that has the power to be able to punish bad behavior, such as what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and what like all that sort of stuff, and what happens in China and like that. What's your take on that? Because that's kind of leaning more into that de-weaponization kind of idea, isn't it? Like it. So, what's your thoughts on? There still needs to be a good guy. There still needs to be a referee. I suppose that's the term of it. So, what's your take on that?
I just think that it's been too one-dimensional, and that the idea of the international good guy, the democratic nation where people have freedom of speech and they have the ability to vote at many, many different levels. That's a great thing about America, the wonderful republic that is America. They've really tried very, very hard. I know they're flawed, and they've been seen in a sense as the international policeman. And people will vary in their opinions as to how good that has been for the world. My judgment would be that on the whole, it's been a good thing. However, you can't really decouple the good guy in terms of being international policeman from the good guy in terms of being a good husband, if you like, or good steward economically. And I think so.
Yep.
The problem that America has really is that it has not been able to demonstrate decent discipline fiscally for decades now, right?
Yep.
Because governments have decided that they can spend as much money as they like, effectively, and they do. They just keep spending. And sometimes, as was the case during the COVID period, they literally printed money. They didn't print physical money, but they literally printed money. Just because of the way the whole system works, you can actually create new money. And that's what's been happening in the United States for a long time. So as you keep on doing that, gradually people lose confidence in your currency because it no longer becomes a good store of wealth. So when you hold US dollar currency in reserves so that you can pay later on for your imports and so on, you really want to be holding a currency which is stable. In other words, its value remains pretty static over a long period of time. But if the United States keeps on spending, they run big government deficits, they either have to have a very high interest rate policy or they have a lot of inflation.
So let me jump on that point. What can I know that we're getting into real dream area here, so forgive me. But in an ideal world, is it possible for a government to stop spending? Like, is it feasible? Like, because a country still needs a run. Like what's it almost seems like that's just the norm. Is it actually possible?
Well, it was possible up until about the middle of the 20th century when there were some very significant shifts in our understanding of how economies work.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, the argument that governments could run a deficit in order to offset unemployment during times of recession, that became widely respected and widely adopted. Now, the problem with it that we've observed, certainly in the latter half, or probably since about the 1980s, is that governments think, well, it's actually okay to spend all the time. That is, we don't have to worry about deficits anymore. And well, it's just not true, because you can sustain, essentially, a government can sustain deficits as long as there's someone around the world who's prepared to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's been easy, perhaps, for the United States because of the fact that the US dollar has been an international currency, but that's becoming less and less true as time goes by. And look, I think some of what the conservative commentators are on about in the United States is nationalism as well. They want to see
Yes.
America strong in the world, and they
Yeah.
see this de-dollarization as evidence that the United States is becoming weaker in the world, and that's true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether they necessarily articulate that it's because they've been a bad boy,
Yeah.
in terms of their own internal economic management. And they're not the only government. I
Yeah.
think politicians have got the idea that it doesn't really matter if we spend money, because, and I don't think they recognise that it's their money. That people, when it's not your money to spend, I think you
Yeah.
tend to spend more, and I think governments tend not to realise that when they spend money, they're taking it from somebody, either
So
directly through taxes or indirectly through inflation.
so do you what let's say that there is a complete de-dollarization of the US dollar and they are no longer the central currency, the international currency. They used to be considered mighty and powerful because of their armed forces, which are now not as, not as they're not inserting their dominance as much as they used to, or people say that they used to, obviously fewer wars and things like that. What's the path forward for a nation like that when they lose their identity or lose their power in military and dollar? Does that mean they need to bring up their industries and exports? Is that what they need to to be able to remain, a mighty nation?
Well, that's one way, but again, you don't necessarily do that by handing out government money.
Yep.
The best way is to keep inflation low, so that your costs are not increasing more rapidly than costs in other countries. So if you've got a high inflation environment, then all the costs of your inputs will go up. So exporting will diminish because your goods are becoming too expensive. Either that, or the income you earn is diminishing, which that's the sort of experience we have in smaller economies. So I think the long-term effect of de-dollarization will be that the United States is forced to do something about profligate government spending, because if they don't, they'll end up with very, very high interest rates that will just crush their economy. See, the problem is de-dollarization is partly a response to the weaponization of the dollar, right?
Yep.
But it's also partly a response to loss of confidence around the world that the United States is a responsible economic manager.
Yeah, well, I mean, I personally feel that power, not power, the downfall of that, because I live overseas, and whenever I transfer money, my business is in Australia, so I earn Australian dollars. Whenever I transfer money to here in the Dominican Republic, it has to go through a United States bank. Actually, it goes through two banks in the United States. And when I moved here like 2 years ago, we were at an exchange rate of about 74, 73, depending on the day, maybe a 72 cents in the dollar. Now I'm getting, I did a transfer the other day at like 61 cents, so I've lost over 10% of the value of my money just because the US dollar is not as powerful or as not as stable anymore.
That's more related to Australia. That's more related to the Australian currency losing its value against the US dollar, which is a slightly different thing altogether.
Okay. Okay. I thought it had to do with the inflation because obviously it all kind of happened around that time as that inflation happened.
Ultimately the US dollar will weaken. At the moment, though, in a sense, the Australian dollar is weakening more than the United States dollar is weakening.
Okay. Yeah.
So the purchasing power of the Australian dollar internationally is falling. That's why you get less money when you transfer Australian dollars into your bank account in the Dominican Republic.
Okay. All right. The more you know, the more you know. Okay. So okay. But let's be honest, the world is losing confidence in the US dollar. It's
in a sentence, the world is losing confidence in the United States, and that's reflecting in their confidence in the dollar.
Yeah.
And you can guarantee with the President Biden's announcement that he's running for president again, it's going to make things worse, not better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's hope that shifts. So, okay, thanks. So as leaders, we kind of just need to be aware of this stuff. That's why I wanted to have this conversation with Dr. Ryder. Just get understanding. This is happening in the world and it affects us as leaders. It affects our businesses. It affects the way we operate. So thank you, Dr. Rod, for sharing your experience in that. However, I just want to shift it just for a moment is what can we as leaders learn from this? And I suppose what I'm getting from this is be careful to be reliant on external forces, I suppose, or be reliant on external things. Try to become as independently reliable in our businesses, because at the moment, all these countries to be able to do trade are reliant on the US dollar. And so if the US dollar is not as strong, if there's issues there, then that affects your trade. If you're not doing things the way the United States wants things done, then you're affected. And so that's to bring it back home to business leaders and ministry leaders as well. We wherever we're leading, we need to minimize our reliance on external things, except for reliance on God. Let me just emphasize that. We have to be completely independent, but completely dependent on God. Dr. Rod, how do we run our businesses as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, but also someone leading in a business, ministry leaders? How do we set ourselves up to minimize our reliance on external sources?
Oh, look, that's a tough one because so many businesses are involved in international trade. Here in Australia, of course, most businesses rely on imported inputs because
Yes.
in Australia, of course, we import a lot of our fuels. We import electronic devices. So every business is affected by what's happening internationally. But if we can just go really macro to start with, be careful how you vote. Right?
Oh, okay. I
You
like
need to
that.
make a judgment every time you go to the ballot box about which candidate associated with any particular party. You want to make sure that you've got to toss other things into this mix as well, but you need to take care that you vote for governments that are not just going to spray money around because it has long-term consequences.
Yeah.
It will cause inflation, and that will weaken your currency, and that will ultimately make imports more expensive, and that's going to increase your costs. So just think really carefully about how you vote. And of course, there are other things you need to take into account as well in order to vote in a godly manner.
Yeah.
But the ballot box will actually determine the overall, if you like, economic environment, because there are usually one or a few parties that are far more conservative in the way that they deal with money than others. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is, if you are doing a lot of international transactions, there are some ways in which you can lock in exchange rates effectively, but you need to take advice on that. And as we often say on this podcast, get the best advice that you can afford. And if you're doing a lot of international transactions, then there are ways in which you can manage at least some of the risk associated with volatile foreign currency exchange rates.
Yeah. And there's some insurances and things like that. I know a lot of people that deal internationally. There's actually particular insurances that can that work to cover if the exchange rates drop and goods cost you more and things like that. So there are those sorts of things. That's really good. And please understand, I'm not saying that we all need to become what are those people that just go and live off the land and completely off the grid. And I'm not talking about that we just need to do that and not be reliant on anyone else. I just mean we need to be careful in who we're relying on. Are the sources that we're relying on reliable? I suppose is a good way to say it, and have wisdom in that. And I suppose talking about money, it's really important for us as leaders to make sure we're in a financial surplus, because it's only when we're not in that surplus that things affect us. Exchange rates, it dropped 10%, whatever. If we're already right on the edge of our finances, that 10% drop will affect our situation. Whereas if we've got surplus, it's like, yeah, that hurts our bottom line, but we're still in surplus, so we're good. If goods go up a little bit more, or a supplier has a little bit too much control over us, if we have surplus in finances, we can actually go to another supplier and maybe pay a little bit more, but we're no longer being held captive by a particular supplier or supply chain. That just make sure. I suppose the thing with this is one thing that you actually started off saying, Dr. Rod, is like this surplus and deficit. I actually kind of like that if we as leaders make sure that we're always in surplus in all different areas of our life. I actually talk about margin, teach that in our leadership development program. Yes, our free leadership development program. Free shameless plug. It is down below, but the link is down below. But we need to have surplus in our energy, in our time, in our finances. We need to make sure we're in surplus, because if we're in deficit, that's when we are reliant on other people. When we're in deficit, that's when we are slave or chained to a particular person, a particular supplier, a particular situation. But when we as leaders are in surplus, that's when we are in control. So my encouragement to you as a leader, wherever you're leading, make sure you're in surplus. So still on this, we're still talking money, but let's transition to our next topic, where we're talking about central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Like we need more acronyms and letters thrown around, but it kind of goes on this trend of this, a central currency and everything like that. Now, all of these nations, we've spoken on this podcast about digital currencies, about cryptocurrency. Unfortunately, we couldn't get Erin on again to speak with us today. As one of our other directors of our company, she's a hobbyist in cryptocurrency, so she was busy. She couldn't join us today, but it goes along this theme of talking about a central currency, and we spoke about the dangers of having this central international currency. Now they're trying to bring in this central digital currency. Is there the same risks with that as we're talking about with the central currency internationally, Dr. Rod, or is it a whole different game?
Well, it's not really a parallel or competing system. So my understanding is that this is not a move to an international currency. It's possible that ultimately we will go back to that original plan post World War II and have an international currency. But the proposals at the moment are for individual central banks to have a digital currency. There are a number that already have them. Most of them are relatively small countries in the Caribbean, a few other places. The largest economy would be Nigeria. Nigeria have adopted a central bank digital currency. And certainly the United States, most of the other higher income countries, they've got policy papers out, lots of research is going on, and it's highly likely that a number of central banks will introduce their own digital currency over the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
And so when we say central bank, we're talking about like the national bank, right? Like the main bank of the country?
Not necessarily. No. A national bank is merely a bank that's got branches all over the country. So that can be a commercial bank. But virtually every country in the world has what we call a central bank or a reserve bank. In the United States, it's actually called the Federal Reserve System because it's made up of reserve banks in the various states. In Australia, it's called the Reserve Bank of Australia. In the United Kingdom, it's actually called the Bank of England. That is actually a special case, which we won't waste time on at the moment. But essentially, a central bank or a reserve bank acts as the government's bank. That is, it's the banker to the government, but it's also the banker for the banking system.
Yes.
And so individual banks, they settle their transactions among one another by going via the central or reserve bank. So in the case of Australia, for example, all the big banks, they actually have accounts at the Reserve Bank of Australia. And when they owe money to another bank, that debt is settled through the Reserve Bank. So they are, in most countries, with very few exceptions, such as the United Kingdom, they are a separate entity which has been established by the government to be the government banker and also banker to the rest of the banks and often the whole financial system.
Now
So they have an interest.
They're saying that this digital current, this central bank digital currency, is going to be the same as paper money, as cash money. You know, it's still it's going to be the same rate and all that sort of stuff. How does it then differ than my bank accounts, which are pretty much digital on my phone and in my bank account on my online? Like, how is it different? I know they're talking about there's advantages with the international payments and stuff like that, but if it's going to be the same, how is it different?
All right. Well, it will be like a parallel or alternative system for making payments and receiving money from overseas. That's the way I understand it. So it will work in pretty much the same way to international currency transactions as they happen today. The mechanism will be a little bit different. Now, I should add that the central bank digital currencies are not quite the same thing as cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrencies are not controlled by government.
Yes.
And the technology behind them is what we call blockchain technology, which essentially, well, another term for that actually is distributed ledger accounts, which means the records of transactions are actually recorded in multiple computers, so they can't be manipulated. And generally with cryptocurrencies, there's a limit to the total amount of the currency that will be issued. It's a little bit like gold, really, like going back to a gold standard. The central bank digital currencies, they will be another kind of what we call fiat currency. They won't be backed by precious metals, for example, but they will be related to existing currencies such as the Australian dollar and the American dollar, because people will be swapping Australian dollars, US dollars, pounds sterling, and so on for digital currencies. So really, it's an alternative system for settling international financial transactions.
Okay. So it's not going to be the local currency.
I'm not aware of any central bank which is currently proposing that. There might be, but no, not really. So we won't all have an account with the central bank and use that to pay wages and to buy our groceries with and so on. Like in principle, we could in principle, but that's not going to happen, I don't think, in a hurry. So I know there are a lot of people very, very concerned about this, and there's no doubt the technology could be used for all sorts of nefarious purposes. That's the plain truth. And look, one of the reasons why a lot of conservative commentators are so concerned is that we saw the Canadian example of the truckers whose bank accounts were frozen because they did something the government didn't like. Absolutely. I mean, I was gobsmacked that this could happen in a nation calling itself a democracy. But this is what's triggered, I think, what's triggered so much concern, particularly among conservative and Christian commentators. They are concerned that governments will force us to use the digital currencies. So we'll all have a wallet for a digital wallet for our digital currency, and government could step in and stop our access anytime. The truth is they could. That's why people are so concerned about it.
Which they've proved that they can do anyway. Like
certainly with the Canadian example, yes, because they did anyway. I mean, I think that was well, I don't even know a strong enough word to use for that because it's demonstrated that, look, if you don't trust your government, the whole system is going to fall apart. And I think the Canadian government, they really did a major disservice to the whole democratic project through what they did. I think it was one of the worst things that's ever happened in terms of economics in human history.
Yeah,
Absolutely
but
dreadful.
Going back to some of those bad things that we're talking about happen. Obviously, there's China have actually rolled out a trial. They're running a campaign of this, and there's fears that obviously China's already very big on tracking. Oh, what's the actual name of the? There's kind of like you've got this personal score where
Yeah, that's sort of social credit, a kind of
social
credit score. That's correct.
That's the
yes.
right.
Yep.
That's the right. And that's one of the fears with this, isn't it? Because that then could be one central way that they're tracking everything and keeping an eye on everything, and then obviously be able to control your finances.
Oh, yes, the technology is there, and it's been, I guess, creeping up on us, and more recently, I guess it's been leaping up on us. The question is, will it be used for that purpose? And I would say that it's become more likely following the behaviour of the Canadian government in relation to the truckers who were protesting against border closures and so on.
But
So
that
it's
wasn't
already
digital
been
currency anyway. So they're
no, it wasn't
already
digital.
like,
It wasn't digital. No, that's right.
How's that different?
Oh, well,
So
certainly
what?
because the records are electronic and access to them is electronic, that's how the Canadian government was able to do that.
Yeah.
So, I sympathise with those. I think a lot of the commentators, they're probably over-egging it at the moment, but in terms of potential, I hate to say it, but they're right. I have people in my own church who are absolutely convinced of this. Maybe it's just a timing thing. I don't think it's something which will happen straight away. And I think there are all sorts of reasons why governments won't agree to an international current, like a single international digital currency.
Yeah.
Technically, that means that all nations would have to give up using monetary policy as a tool of managing their economies. And we'd end up like countries like Spain and Italy during the global financial crisis, when those nations, as nations, were threatened with bankruptcy because they were using the euro, so they didn't have their own currency. And I think that's one of the reasons why it'll be a long time yet before we agree to give up our own individual currencies and adopt an international currency. However, the technology is there, and we should be careful that we don't ridicule those who view it in a far more sinister way than I do. I don't think we've got there yet, but I'll definitely concede that the technology is there. All we need is a few more evil people.
So is this avoid it because of this whole conspiracy theory, or is it get on board? We need to be modern people and get with the times,
Look, I don't think we should live in fear.
Yeah.
I just think that, as individuals, there's not a lot we can do. We're not the ones who are making decisions. As I said a little earlier, we need to use, if we live in a democracy, we need to use our vote very, very wisely, prayerfully. We need to do the very best we can to have good people, good men and women in power. We need them in politics. We need them in business. We need them, throughout the economy. So we need to shift the general sorts of philosophies that apply at the level of politics and business and so on. That in other words, we've got to move, I think, take a step back from what some people would call wokeism. I think it's going to do damage to us all. But it's really hard. Look, I wouldn't advise a company, no, don't, whatever you do, use a central bank digital currency, because it's not the technology which is inherently evil. It's the people who are using it.
Which goes back to what you were saying about the vote, which is like, it's good. Don't be afraid of the technology, but be careful with who you vote to be in charge of that technology.
That's right.
Yeah. No, it's really good. Okay, so look, I think that was a really good advice from Dr. Rod is let's not live in fear. As leaders, let's not live in fear, but let's make sure we can influence the right things. Make sure we vote the right way. Make sure that we can be as much in control of the movements of these things that are they're happening anyway. Like Dr. Rod said, the technology is there. It's going to happen. So let's not be afraid of it because we know that there's nothing to fear because at the end of the day, our God is in control. So have complete faith, have wisdom and wariness as you're stepping forward. Don't be in fear, but use your vote. Vote with your money. Vote with your actual vote as well, and influence those around you. Use your influence to help educate. And I suppose that's a good word. Is make sure we're educated as well and staying up on things. But let's shift from talking about central banks to the Australian central bank, which Dr. Rod, you mentioned before, which was the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia. They have just done an overhaul of their board. Now, that seems like something, I don't know, kind of when you first hear it, it's like, oh, are they in danger? Is that scary? The Reserve Bank is meant to be this stable thing, and there's an uphaul with their whole board and everything like that. But it's a good thing. Is that right? Like what's happening with the RBA in Australia, Dr. Rod?
Well, a lot of things could happen. The report, which has only just been released, it was delivered to the government on the 31st of March, which was just inside their deadline. They were supposed to report by the end of March. So the report's dated the 31st of March. And it's made 51 recommendations, some of which may well affect what's happening at the level of interest rates generally throughout the economy. Many of the other recommendations really refer to more internal stuff, like there's a lot of recommendations in there concerning their own staff and all kinds of things. I suppose probably the two most important recommendations, and the government has said that they will accept all 51, at least in principle. There might be a few little changes as we go, but they've said that in principle, they support all 51 recommendations. The major ones that are likely to affect Australians generally will be a move to create two boards. Currently, the Reserve Bank of Australia, like most companies, has a board. Now, that board has responsibilities in terms of the governance function that any board would have, but they also have responsibility for establishing what we call in Australia the target cash rate, which is essentially the rate of interest on funds that are borrowed overnight by banks when they borrow from one another. Now, one of the major recommendations is that we establish one board to provide the governance function, which would be like the board of any public company, for example, and then another board of expert advisors who will make the running on setting that cash interest rate target. Now, that other board will be populated primarily, as I understand it, by experts in economics. That bothers me a little bit. Someone who knows a bit about economics and economists, because they don't always get it right. And sometimes, they sort of grab onto a theory which doesn't turn out to be too good in practice. And we've had fairly recent experience of that with what they call modern monetary theory, which essentially says the government can spend money and we can print money, and that will increase production, so you don't have to worry too much about inflation. I'm oversimplifying it, but that turned out to be a bad theory, and it's not getting much of a run these days. But look, in principle, I don't think that can do us any great harm in separating the functions. So you've got, broadly speaking, a normal governance board, and then this specialist board, which will call make the calls on interest rates. They're proposing to reduce the number of meetings from 11 per year to 8. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, particularly if they're very fast-moving events. That it may be advisable to be meeting more frequently than that. And I'm not really sure if there's a good reason for reducing those meetings. It might reduce some costs, but I don't know whether that will necessarily ultimately prove to be a good thing for Australia.
Is the idea of that then there's going to be less potential, fewer potential times that the interest rate is then going to change?
Yeah, but look, I think maybe I'm a little bit out of step with a lot of others, but I feel that throughout its history, and I've been sort of hanging around this idea now for about 40 years. I'm not a spring chicken. My observation is that the Reserve Bank has generally been quite conservative with interest rates. In other words, I think there's a kind of corporate desire to keep interest rates as low as they can and as stable as they can.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that, generally speaking, they've wrecked our economy. I think, generally speaking, they've done a pretty good job. Now, certainly, one of the issues that came up was that the governor of the Reserve Bank, that is the boss and the chair of the board, he made a statement a couple of years ago now that there wouldn't be interest rate increases until 2024. Now, as it turned out, that was wrong. Now, I think the reason why he had the confidence to make that statement was that he, the board in general, the people in the bank who are providing advice and so on, had really got onto this modern monetary theory bandwagon, and they weren't expecting inflation to turn out the way it did. But of course, we got inflation. All those countries that spent billions and billions and billions of dollars during COVID, which was financed effectively by printing money, they've now all got relatively high rates of inflation. And so central banks all over the world are responding with fairly rapid increases in interest rates. But look, even in Australia, it's nothing like it is in many, many other countries. So I will still argue that the Reserve Bank has tended to be quite conservative. So I don't think reducing the number of meetings each year is going to make that much difference, frankly.
But tell me, how does this change of creating a second board and all that sort of stuff, how does it, because obviously that's the story that you just shared of the who was he? He was the governor. He said that they'd stay, the rates wouldn't change until 2024, and then we just went through a couple of rate rises.
Oh yeah, we've had 10 rate rises consecutively, except last month rates were stable, and some of the market economists are predicting that they won't make any changes at their next meeting either. So people get a bit of a breather, I suppose you could say.
How does this board change stop that issue? Because obviously the news are jumping on
experts. The answer is always experts. You put experts on this board, so they're going to have better performance. I mean, I don't agree with that because I know what experts are like. And look, the major cause of inflation is government spending. Anybody who's done first-year economics in university or even high school economics, it's as plain as the nose on my face, which is a relatively big nose, all right? It's government spending. Inflation has not been the fault of the central banks. Now, you might argue that in the case of Australia, we didn't increase interest rates soon enough. Well, that you could level that argument at central banks around the world because they'd been lulled into a false sense of security. They were all surprised by how rapidly inflation took off. There's a few like me who weren't, because we never bought into modern monetary theory in the first place. But on the whole, you know, the economics profession was kind of swept with this new approach to understanding economics and economic policy, it just turned out to be wrong. Well, that wouldn't be the first time. So just having experts doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better outcomes, in my opinion. And it's just that, it's just an opinion. But look, I have had a look through the report. I can't claim that I've read it word for word, but I have looked through the report. It's a pretty good report. It's pretty thorough. They've certainly, the three people who are on the panel, who are experts themselves, by the way, they've done quite a lot of research, or they probably didn't do it themselves. They had it done, but I had a look at all the references in the back of the report, pretty comprehensive. But look, I think what was lacking really was deep analysis about how effective the Reserve Bank Australia has been, say, over the last 50 years as compared to other central banks. Look, from what I've seen, it's no worse, really no better than others. Look, the other major change that we need, I think, to touch on, Craig, is that the Reserve Bank will shift its emphasis from a very strong focus on keeping inflation within 2 to 3% per annum to also being concerned directly about full employment, however you measure that. And we can have long debates about how to measure full employment.
Really?
Now, look, it was in the original Reserve Bank Act, the Reserve Bank Act 1959, listed full employment as one of the objectives of the central bank anyway. One of the problems is, and again, look, if you studied a little bit of economics, you would know this, it's pretty difficult to hit two targets using the same policy lever.
Mm-hmm.
And look, you can prove that with nice, elegant mathematical models. And everybody who studied economics in university in the 1970s went through the mathematics to prove it. I don't know that it's being taught in many universities. Look, frankly, economics isn't being taught in a lot of universities these days. So I think probably economic literacy is a lot less than it used to be overall. And a lot of people who might be regarded as experts don't know enough economics to be experts in economics, quite frankly. But I think this is a recipe for making the Reserve Bank less effective, because their main instrument or their main policy lever is interest rates.
Yeah.
And at certain times, there's clearly a trade-off between keeping inflation low and having full employment.
Yeah.
And so goodness only knows how the board of experts are going to sort that one out. And there was a lot of research and a long debate in the late 1970s and early 1980s about this. And the broad conclusion was that your central bank, using the monetary lever, should focus on keeping inflation low. I think it's unwise to move to those dual goalposts, because while they do need to take into account how interest rates might affect employment, because that's real people we're dealing with, the outcomes of their decisions, both on interest rates. It's real people who gain or lose, and quite frankly, there are gainers and losers every time interest rates are changed in either direction. So that's the other big shift, and I don't have a good feeling about that. I don't know that that's going to do us a positive favour in the long run. But those are the two main changes: having a separate board of experts doing the interest rate thing, and then broadening the objectives to focus, well, really to take it back to the original Reserve Bank Act. That's, as far as I can see, that's what they're doing. I don't think it augurs well. Look, unless you've got a central bank that's dealing with inflation and a government that's reining in its expenditure, and only you only want a deficit when the economy is going into recession. But we're running deficits basically all the time. We'll run decades of deficits. And
so when you say that, does the RBA or a central bank, do they have any influence over the government and their spending? Because isn't it,
no,
if the
no,
government
no,
if the government says print money, it's that central bank that prints the money. Is that
Well, it
correct?
doesn't work quite like that, but one way of funding government deficits is they essentially borrow money from the central bank. Because remember, the central bank is banker to the government.
Yes.
But unlike you and me, you and I have to go to the bank, cap in hand, and ask them for
Do an
money, right?
application. Mm-hmm.
The federal government really doesn't have to ask; they just take it. So
just do a withdrawal.
I mean, it
When
would
they
be
bring
lovely
up
if we all had
account
a bank like
balance,
that.
it's
Yeah.
unlimited, is it?
I mean,
It's
effectively,
got,
the government the government has an unlimited overdraft through its own central bank. That's what it amounts to.
that'd be nice.
Look, if we want long-term, consistent, low inflation, high employment, and reasonable rates of growth, governments have to get out of the habit of overspending.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So this shift, good thing, bad thing, indifferent?
Look, I don't have confidence that a board of experts is necessarily going to do it better than we already have, but I don't think that will do us any harm. I am more concerned about how on earth we hit two targets using the same instrument.
Yeah.
It's like aiming an arrow at two targets.
Well,
you can hit one or the other, but you're not going to get them both.
As Confucius says, he who chases two rabbits catches none. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's almost like that. I like that.
Yeah.
So
but look, just if I can say it, overall, it's a pretty good review. And I know some commentators, especially on the conservative side, have been very critical of it. There have been comments made, for example, they haven't done any research, etc., etc. But I would say they've actually done quite a lot of research. They've taken input from a lot of experts, many of whom have long experience in these matters. So I would say it's a pretty well researched document. Mm-hmm. Most of the recommendations are quite sensible, and they will improve the overall governance of our central bank. Those two main ones, though, the first probably won't make a big difference. The second, I think, is going to lead to problems in the future.
From a governance point of view, you mentioned governance, and I know your specialty areas is governance. This whole two board idea, is that a normal, not normal, but has that been done? Is that done anywhere else?
Yes, some. Yeah, it's not all that rare. It does happen elsewhere. And look, it may be that we really shouldn't call it a board. So you just say you've got a governance board, and then you've got this other body.
Yeah,
because it's not a board in the normal sense of.
So it's almost
just a
committee.
Board. You could call it something like the Committee on Interest Rates if you wanted to, or the Committee on Monetary Policy, or something like that. So having the two boards itself isn't going to create any. There won't be any problems that arise from the two boards per se. Put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's bring it back to us as leaders. That's really good information for us to know. Be aware as leaders. Be aware that these changes are happening. How can it affect us? Probably not just being aware of how it affects the monetary interest rate. What can we learn as leaders? There was a couple of key things that you mentioned in there. Obviously, he who chases two rabbits catches none. So make sure that we know what our goal is, what our one goal is. Now, yes, in business, there's a whole bunch of things we have to do and have to juggle a whole bunch of balls and spin a lot of plates while we're trying to ride a unicycle. Like, yes, there's all these things we have to do as leaders, but we need to know what our ultimate one goal, our one outcome, or ultimately our purpose. I think I would put it down to. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing that you did mention, you repeated it a lot. Emphasized it a lot, is I don't really trust experts, or what are experts? My dad used to say an expert is just a former drip under pressure, right? So probably some older generation will get that. That might go straight over the head of others. But rewind this back and listen to it again and see if you get it. But obviously, we need experts. obviously, I mean, I'm a business coach. I advise people on running their businesses and things like that. So I would consider myself an expert. I would consider you an expert. I wouldn't discredit experts straight away, but I kind of agree with what you're saying, and let me try to maybe put my words to what you're saying. Is what I think you're saying is experts, we need to take on their advice, but we can't blindly take on their advice. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is like experts, yes, we have to take their information, like you're saying, this report, it's been put together by experts, it's good information, but then we need to interpret and apply that with wisdom ourselves.
Well, just don't treat experts like you'd treat God. That's all I would say.
Like
Experts are
that.
fallible.
Yes.
and you see, the thing is, experts are usually operating on the basis of an underlying theory. And that theory may or may not turn out to be a good theory for the particular circumstances that the economy finds itself in at any particular time. And economists have learned a lot over the last 200 years. And I think on the whole, policy has been better for it. But economics, like every other academic discipline, is actually subject to fads.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a little bit skeptical of experts. Look, I'm the best expert, right?
Yes.
And that's how we all think.
I agree.
That's how we all
think.
Mm-hmm. So I think we do need a healthy dose of skepticism. And I always like to know, well, what theoretical perspective or even worldview is the expert coming from? Because it does make a difference.
Yeah. I really like that perspective of like, every expert is basing their expertise on a particular theory and a particular outcome. So or on a particular principle, we need to make sure we know what that principle is that they're basing that on to know that we agree with it or not. And if it's, like you mentioned, worldview, is it in line with my worldview? Is there something I can learn from it, or is it something that I won't take from it? Because there are a lot of experts out there and all these gurus talking about, running a business and bettering your life and managing your money and investing and all that. There's a lot of gurus out there, but I think that's a really good point. Is like, what is their foundational principles? What are they basing their expertise on, or their opinion? What's their underlying theory? I think that's actually really good advice, Dr. Rod. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's actually, I'll finish this off with a little quote that there was an expert. Now, I found a link to say that an expert says, but I kept following the links of the references and no one actually said who that expert was. But I'm going to say this about the RBA. An expert says Australians should not be under any illusions that changes will result in lower interest rates. Because there is a lot of stuff talking about that with the board. Oh, now they're going to manage interest rates better. They're going to stay low and everything like that. Don't be under any illusion that that's going to be the case. They may come in, as Dr. Rod said, they're experts. They may just come in, and they're economists, which have a different theory. They may run it up. Who knows? Maybe they may fall in love with the days when interest rates were 18%. But let's hope not. Let's pray. And at the end of the day, like Dr. Rod said about experts, they're not God. There is only one. And he is in control. Let's jump quickly to our next topic, talking about Australia banking. Let's talk specifically about ANZ Bank. ANZ Kills Cash. That's right. An ANZ Bank, a report came out recently saying that ANZ Bank, which is one of the biggest big four banks in Australia, we call it the big four banks, they have stopped handling cash at some branches. Now, you can still go to an ATM and take money out and all that sort of stuff, but they've stopped handling cash over the counter, which has actually brought a lot of uproar. And I'm like, we don't use cash anymore. We very rarely ever use cash. Do you want to, if I'm just looking at this from a business perspective, seeing them, they've got to get cash trucks that come and now make sure that they've got cash in the branch, that they have to open and close each till and count it in and count it out every day just for a few people that are bringing cash. You can do everything through the ATM, which is just outside the branch, open 24 hours and much quicker than standing and waiting in line for a bank teller. So I kind of see the business efficiencies of it, and but there's some uproar because they're kind of like, I think everyone's starting to feel like this is our trend towards a cashless society. And there's been this uproar of people claiming that they want to boycott ANZ and go and use one of the other banks because we want to teach them, because they say that there's fears that the vulnerable community members will be affected. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I kind of think that if you leave ANZ to go to another bank to do this, like, what are you going to do when that bank does it? Because let's be honest, it's inevitable. We are going to be a cashless society at some point, whether it's in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it's going to happen. So are you just going to keep jumping from bank to bank until you're in the last bank that actually does cash? Dr. Rod, what does this move signify?
Oh, look, I think they've done a business case and just decided that it doesn't make business sense to have some of their branches with cash, because, as you say, it takes a lot to manage cash. I used to work as a bank teller. I know.
Oh, really?
Long time ago. But I was a bank teller for a while, and it takes a bit of managing. There's no doubt about that, especially if you get to the end of the day and you're a bit short.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I understand why they do it, but I just wonder, actually, when they did their business case, was part of the business case, hey, how will the public receive this? Because if there actually is a backlash and you lose customers, well, that might not do any favors for the bottom line as well. So I do wonder how far they went in terms of developing the business case. But I would also observe that the ANZ and probably other banks now have, I suppose you could call them, little booth banks in shopping centres.
Yes. Yeah.
Now they're cashless. They will usually have an ATM, and sometimes they'll have a money counting machine attached to the ATM, so you can make deposits and you can make withdrawals at the ATM. So,
well, I mean, there's a lot of those isolated ATMs that
there are a lot of
at those booths that just don't take deposits anyway.
Yeah, no, but look, I think it's legitimate to worry about people who are not used to doing digital banking, older folk, for example, maybe some people who are disabled in one way or another may not easily be able to use ATMs. Some people don't trust the money counting machines, although I've found them to be very, very accurate, even with pretty crumpled notes. They're pretty good at recognising the. In fact, I've never had a mistake, and I've used the automatic machines quite a bit. I don't really like using them because it's inconvenient for me. It's a bit of a hassle, but I do nevertheless, and I found those machines to be very accurate. Because the other issue is people are saying, oh, well, they're pushing us to become a cashless society and they'll have all this control, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I would say that's a legitimate fear or a worry. I just don't think we should live in fear.
Yes.
My God is looking after me. That's all I can say. And the worst that anybody can do with me is kill me. And I still win. Like, I'm just not going to ruin my life by worrying about all of this. Look, I mean, I hear people, great leaders, Christian leaders, whom I respect, are saying, well, it's all the mark of the beast. Now, as soon as I hear people saying, they'll say, no, I'd really like to sit down and listen to your coherent understanding of end times. Because I've got a particular approach to understanding end times Other people have different approaches. And I think that matters. So it really, and I always want to know, have you got a coherent, I don't care if you don't agree with me in terms of timelines and so on, but have you got a coherent view? I think we should be very careful about equating what we observe with any particular incident that is going to happen during the tribulation period and so on. So, I'm a little bit wary when I hear people, oh, mark of the beast. Maybe, but that came up with credit cards way back in the 1970s and so on and so forth.
Yes.
The point is, technologies that have been developing over a long period of time, and they have potential to be outworked for evil rather than for good. And yes, you can fit many of them into some of the prophetic words or prophetic passages in Revelation and in the book of Daniel as well. And I understand why people look at it and say, man, the end is coming, or the end is here. But again, I refuse to live in fear. And I do have a particular view about the historical sequence of the end times. I don't have fear, because I believe that the Word of God teaches that we Christians will not experience God's wrath. So we'll either be taken out and we won't experience the tribulation period, or if we're on earth when it happens, just as God protected Israel from the plagues that Pharaoh was subject to, God will protect us. Otherwise, he's telling lies in the Bible, and I don't believe he is. So that's why I don't fear. So essentially, we'll either be taken out before it all happens, or if we're still here, God will protect us. We're not going to go through that time of wrath, whether or not we're on earth. And I can show you well-respected systematic theologies which go through this in very great detail. So I don't worry too much about that. I agree with you that eventually we will go cashless. I'm practically cashless myself. I do. Look, I had a $100 note in my wallet for over 6 months. I never have more than about $100 in my wallet, and I hardly ever use it. Now, I know some people who still prefer to do nearly everything in cash, and I have no disrespect for them whatsoever. And some of them will say it's because they don't want to be sort of drawn into this vortex of a cashless society. I respect that. But I do think that ultimately, and it will take a while, it may take another 20 years, that there probably won't be any cash except in museums, and it will all be electronic.
Yeah. That's been one of the big shocks that I have had moving to the Dominican Republic. Is in Australia, I wasn't only cashless, I was walletless. I had Apple Pay on my phone. I had my driver's license on my phone because I was in New South Wales driver's license. So it was a digital license, and I literally could leave home with my key and my phone, and I had everything. Moving here, they don't do Apple Pay here, so I have to have that. They're cash, everything's cash here. So if you don't have cash on you, there is almost once a day there'll be something that I'll be caught up with that if I didn't have cash on me, I wouldn't be able to do. And so, yeah, it's interesting, to see how advanced Australia is in that, and yet people are still afraid of what's next. And like you're saying, once again, Dr. Rod, is like, let's not live in fear. It's gonna happen. These things happen. Let's be in control. Let's have wisdom. But I think one of the good lessons here was what you said is about when we as business owners or as leaders make decisions, we obviously make a business decision. We get someone to give us all the facts and figures, but do we take into account the effect on the actual customers, the people that God has called us to serve? Yes, it's about the bottom line, but remember, God has called us to serve people, not a bottom line. And so we as leaders do have to manage those things. We have to manage the difference between, yes, we have to be profitable and what we were talking about before as being financially surplus, but also looking after those people. Are those people that we are called to serve going to be disadvantaged, going to be put out, are going to be, I mean, not just their noses out of joint, because, you know, sometimes you're just going to put some noses out of joint moving your business forward. But are you leaving the core of your business? And are you moving away from what it is that God's actually called you to do in your business? So that's actually a really good point of Rod, is let's make sure as leaders we are taking into consideration the bottom line, but also the people and how they will be impacted, and see, let's not allow that to prevent us from moving forward and advancing our businesses and our technologies and the way we do things. Yes, we've got to improve, always improve, but make sure we're taking our customers and clients along that journey with us rather than just cutting them off anyway. So, Dr. Rod, let's move to our second last topic, talking about leaders and money. I thought this was actually a really good story to kind of wrap up. We've been talking a lot about money today, but I heard this story this morning actually, and yesterday, sorry, and as I was preparing for this, and thought this would be a really nice message to join, because we're talking about leaders and leadership and money, and the challenges we have to face with all the money that's happening, with all the money situations that are happening in the world. But there's a leader, an industry leader, that is now a ministry leader, that has actually made decision external to money, or actually at the cost of some money. And let me talk about Granger Smith. Granger Smith, he is a country music, let's call him star, that he's just recently come out saying that he's quitting the country music industry and going and serving in his local church full time. He's doing a master's degree in theology, as well, to get to know God some more. But he's had this incredible journey with God and his relationship with God over the last few years. He has 4 children. Unfortunately, one of them in 2019, at 3 years old, died, drowned, in their local water hole in their home. And he's been on this journey building, trying to find what God is in this whole situation. And he's actually written a book. His son's name was River, and he's written a book called Like a River, which talks about his journey with Christ and like post losing his 3-year-old son. But it's really interesting that he's left all of this behind and chosen to dedicate his life to Christ. Now, this is just the next season. Who knows what God has for him next. But he was asked about why didn't he stay in the industry where he's got lots of influence and obviously still make money and have the influence there for Christ. And it was really interesting. His response was, it's there. He would find it. I really appreciated his honesty and his vulnerability, saying, I struggle with ego. I struggle with the attention, with wanting attention and needing attention and praise from people. And he says, there's no way that I could be a star, a country music, star. I couldn't be that and not be there for, even if I was there for the glory of God, not be there receiving the accolades and glory myself. And I thought that was a really good take. Is he really did give up money? Look, I've tried to do lots of research, and there's not much information online. His income ranged from $100,000 a year to $1 million a year. I would assume that as a country music star, there's pretty good money in country music. He wasn't earning $100,000 a year. Let's just assume that. But I think the best estimates that I could gather is he was making about $1 million a year, and he's chosen to give that up to pursue Christ. Dr. Rod, as you know, I went through a situation like that. I wasn't a country music star or anything like that, but I gave up my business, and I gave up my whole life situation to really dedicate my time to Christ. It was the best time of my life, the best thing I could ever do. And you were a crucial part of that, because you actually allowed me couch surf, so to speak, but didn't give me a couch. You gave me a room and a place to stay, and food in my belly and everything like that, which I'm forever grateful for. But what's your take on someone like this? Obviously, you got a little bit of love for country music. How do you feel about this situation?
I have mixed feelings, actually, because you're right. I like country music. I actually did a Christian country music radio program for 11 years.
Yes.
And loved it, absolutely loved it. I met some of the most amazing people, interviewed lots of country music artists, and not just singers, but songwriters as well, a couple of producers too. I loved it, loved every minute of it. But like you, I made a decision a few years ago to give up full-time paid employment as CEO of a higher education institution here in Australia, because I wanted to do my pastoring job better, and I wanted to spend more time on two fabulous global ministries, Business as Mission and what is now known as Kingdom Initiatives. And it was really impossible for me to work full-time as a CEO and pastor to the extent that I wanted to, and also to be more heavily involved in those two fabulous global ministries or global movements. So I can understand to some extent what he's been through. And look, the only question I would ever ask of anybody in a position like this is, are you following the Lord? So has the Lord called you to go into a full-time ministry position of one kind or another? And if the Lord has done that, then there's no argument, is there? I would just talk, if he'd come to me for advice before he made this decision, no special reason why he would, but if he'd come to me, I would have talked with him about the whole notion of calling and of assignment. So my advice would have been, sit down and figure out whether your calling is actually in the area of country music or whether it's in the area of ministry. Now, I happen to believe that our calling doesn't really change radically or much over time, but our assignment could change significantly.
Yeah, that's good.
And, I would just watch, I guess, interested from afar to see exactly how his talent marries up with whatever ministry he ends up in a little down the track. He hasn't defined exactly what kind of ministry he's going to pursue. He said, I'm not going to go and start a church or anything. Who knows? But that will become apparent down the track. And look, even if he made a mistake, it's not irreversible. So I really honor him for what he's doing, because an artist such as him, it's not just giving up a stream of income, as you say, giving up a lot of money, $1 million or more a year. It's giving up the opportunity to interact with other people in the industry. It's maybe letting down your fans. There's a lot of considerations, and I have no doubt
the fame,
he's canvassed them all.
The ego stroke that you get from it, like that would be really difficult to go, okay.
I think so.
Even though I think that even though he acknowledged that that's a weakness and that he enjoys that, that praise. I mean, you're standing on stage and there are thousands of people, literally hands raised, worshiping you. Like it's there has to be there. I would hope that he's being counseled and being advised, by psychologists or whatever as well, to make sure this transition, the emotions of this transition are being managed, because there's going to be loss. Because I remember when did you go through this same thing, Dr. Rod? I know when I gave up that time, there was a big identity loss for me, because I was the business person. I was the, like that's who I was. I was the business person. I was the one who funded things. I was the guy that had money. I was always, there was part of that transition was I was losing, as Christ says, we need to die to ourselves. That was a difficult part of the transition, not just the practical changes in my lifestyle and things like that, but that identity change and the emotional change. Did you go through that same thing in that transition for you too?
No.
You were a lot more weathered and seasoned person by that stage, obviously.
I had another major shift a decade or so prior to that, when I left a government-funded university to go and work for a Christian higher education provider. That was a massive change for me, because I was absolutely certain for many, many years that my assignment, my calling has always been built around communication.
Yes.
So I've been a university lecturer for a long time. I was a radio announcer. I engaged in public speaking, those kinds of things over a long, long period of time. It goes back more than 50 years, in fact. I can trace it back to there. But I felt my assignment was to be a Christian in a senior management position in a publicly funded, that is a government-funded university. The process by which I came finally to the conclusion that my assignment was changing, it ran over 18 months. And that was quite traumatic, to make that shift from being a Christian in a senior management position in a thoroughly sort of secular environment to teaching other Christians how to be Christians in the marketplace was a massive and somewhat traumatic shift for me.
Yes.
So that happened. That was a process over 2007, 2008. I eventually made the shift in 2009. But this second major shift from a full-time CEO of a startup higher education institution into, I guess, if you like, full-time or fuller time ministry, that there was no trauma there. I suppose because I was already working part-time as a pastor. We'd already planted a church, so there was already a church. I had already been involved for the best part of 10 years with both Kingdom Initiatives and a Business's Mission, and my desire was to get more heavily involved in all three of those areas. So that transition wasn't difficult. I suppose there was some fear about, well, how do I pay the bills? But God has proven very, very faithful in that area, and we've managed to pay the bills. We've paid all our bills in full, on time, despite the fact that I'm only paid 1 day a week by the church, and I just pick up a little bit of part-time university lecturing here and there. So that first change, that was traumatic. The second change, no, it wasn't.
I think it's beautiful. Okay, so I just love your defining the difference between your assignment and your calling, because we can often get those caught up. When we talk about purpose, obviously our leadership program is based on that theory about we lead from and through our purpose, and our calling as leaders is to lead other people to discover their purposes as well. And so I love it because we do tend to get those confused, because our purpose does take on different, it wears different hats, I suppose we could say, throughout time. I could say, for me, very similar to you, Dr. Roddy, is mine's always been around teaching. I've always been a teacher. Even if I think back to as a kid, I was always trying to teach other people other things, So that's what God has always called me to teach. It's where He's called me to execute that, and the actual focus of that has shifted over time. And so, a couple of things is, don't hold tight to an assignment, confusing it for a calling, I suppose would be one bit of advice. If you're struggling to discover what your purpose is in life or as a leader, once again, free leadership program below. The first 10 weeks we actually spend helping you identify what your purpose is. Free leadership program, shameless plug. Chuck it, have a look down below. But make sure you don't get confused with your calling and your assignment. Don't be holding tight to something that God's actually trying to move you on from, because you have that identity wrapped up. And I think that's probably, thinking back to it, is that was what I had my identity. I thought that was my calling, but my calling wasn't that. My calling was still around teaching. It had just shifted to teaching in the church for a season. So our prayer is for Granger Smith and his family, like, well done on making that tough decision, both a very financial and probably emotional and ego decisions, to let them all go. And well done. And I just pray that you're getting the right support along the way. I pray that your fans are supportive of you and can understand this, and they can not be selfish in their loss, but be excited for this new chapter for you. And hopefully some of your fans will be inspired by this, and hopefully seek out Christ as well. So we're praying for you, Granger. But that kind of leads us to our leadership lessons from Luke, our last segment for today. And I want to go to Luke 8, chapter 8, verse 18. And it is headed up called The Rich Ruler. Now, we know the story, and it's spoken about a lot. And obviously, as soon as we were talking about money, it's one of the money chapters, or the one of the money. I suppose it's not really a parable, but we can use it as a parable. It was something that did happen, but we're talking about money, and then finish off with this story about Granger Smith, transitioning from his life of fame and money and celebrity and success to a life of ministry and laying it all down. And I felt like there was no other passage, especially in Luke, that kind of just emphasized this. And we know this, that there was a ruler, a wealthy man that was listening to Jesus speak and to teach, and he said, "Look, I've done everything. I've been a good man. What else do I need? I've ticked all the boxes. I follow all of the rules. What else do I need to go do to get into heaven?" And Jesus replied, obviously, "Give it all up. Give it all away and follow me. Give it all away. Lay down your life. You die to yourself." This is what he's saying. Die to yourself and follow me. And we all know the end of that story is, unfortunately, that rich young ruler could not handle that sacrifice. And so because he was not as good of a man as Granger Smith, who was able to accept that call and lay it all down. And unfortunately, that man, that rich young ruler, has missed out on a lot. Now, I want to end it because the last two verses of this is something that I've held true to from that moment where I felt God call me to give up everything. And I gave up everything. I gave up an engagement. I gave up gave up my apartment. I gave up my business. I gave up everything to go and pursue Christ. And these are the verses that did carry me through in those tough times. Was verse 29 and 30. I tell you the truth, Jesus said, no one who has left home or wife or brothers or parents or children for the sake of the kingdom of God will fail to receive many times as much in this age and in the age to come eternal life. There's some verses that or some translations, actually some versions of even the same translation says will fail to receive 100-fold or 100 times what they have sacrificed. And a lot of people talk about this and they say with this you lose, yes, you sacrifice things here, but what you'll gain in heaven will be amazing. Yes, but if you look at this, it does say that in eternal life we'll receive amazing things, but it says we'll fail to receive many times as much in this age. In this age. So even when you sacrifice and give up for Christ, he's promised that you will receive now. Now, I'm not going to go into prosperity doctrine. I'm not going to ask you to now send in all of your money to our ministry so that you can receive everything. No. What I know from my own experience is looking at this is I gave up all of those things and served Christ and followed him and just dedicated. Now, since then, I'm married. I've got a kid. I'm living in a different country now, and I've still got my challenges, but I have received back. But it's not just those things. The thing that I know that I've received is I know I handle stress a lot better now. I handle challenges a lot better now because I've given up everything and I have faith in Christ, and he carried me through. He provided for me. He put people like Dr. Rod in my world to help support, but through Dr. Rod, God provided for me. Through many other people, God provided for me. I went years with zero income and still managed to travel internationally, get married overseas, do all this with no income. And it was God that provided. And I gained so much from that in just my character has grown. My knowledge, my experience has grown because of what I sacrificed. And so I know that I personally have received so much more in return than what I had before. So my encouragement to you is, if you feel like Christ is calling you to give up something. Now, I don't mean everyone should now run out and give up absolutely everything and run out and just go and volunteer in your local church. That's not what I'm talking about. I felt God called me to do that in that season. But what is it that God's calling you to give up? And like Granger Smith, he said, he actually says he himself knew he couldn't stay in the industry, but he's not speaking against anyone else who feels like they are called to stay in the industry. He's not saying that everyone should give it up. And that's not what I'm saying here. But what is it that God's called you to give up? Dr. Rod, what's your take on that that prosperity doctrine at the end there?
Oh, I believe in prosperity. It's the heart of God. The very first words that humankind ever heard from God were words of blessing. And
Yes.
all of that stuff there, way back there in Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28, is about blessing humanity. So God's default position, if you like, is to bless us. But of course, what really matters is what we do with the blessing.
Yes,
so being rich isn't a problem in and of itself. Being rich, but if you like, gathering riches for your own selfish or self-centered purposes that is the
Yep.
problem, because that generates evil. And of course, the Bible says elsewhere that love of money is the root of many kinds of evil. So we don't want to develop a love for money, which apparently the rich young ruler had.
Yeah.
So I think this is a promise that God's heart toward us is a heart of blessing. He wants to bless us. He wants to see us prosper, but
Yep.
there's a purpose for prosperity, which ultimately revolves around the Great Commission. That is, getting the message of hope and encouragement that there is in the gospel out to every person on this planet. So we're not blessed just for the sake of ourselves. We're blessed for the sake of the whole wide world. And
Yep.
I know we've got to finish up very, very soon, but there's another little verse here which I really love, and this is when Jesus says, "The things which are impossible with men are possible with God," because the disciples or those who are listening, when Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, people marvel. So, well, how can anybody get to heaven? And then Jesus has got this beautiful response. Well, what's impossible for you lot, it's possible for God.
Yes.
So God can make it possible for any of us. If we respond to him, he can make it possible for any of us, rich, poor, or somewhere in between, to enter the kingdom of heaven. And of course, obviously we can't prolong this discussion now because we are running out of time, but this is not a criticism of rich people.
No, not at all.
At the time, there would have been very few people who were rich who hadn't exploited somebody else in order to become rich. That was the way things worked back then, because there was no Christian worldview. Back then, human beings the human life wasn't valued as it is now. It was Christianity that introduced the idea that every human being has value, because every human being is created by and loved by God. That idea didn't exist at the time, and the rich got rich because they exploited other people. Now, certainly some people get rich that way today, but most people who get rich through commerce. And that's one of the reasons why we're here. We want people to do commerce better, to lead better in commerce, because we want to see people generating riches that can then be used for kingdom purposes. So it's also important, I think, for us to remember that what's impossible for man, that the natural evil heart of man, makes it impossible for us to enter the kingdom. But when God gets a hold of us, he can do what is impossible for us to do on our own.
And also, I think that, I suppose a thought to this is, if, once again, I don't want anyone to think from this is like, now I have to go and give up everything. And no, like, once again, hear from God, what God is calling you. There is something that God is calling you to give up. Now, Jesus interact with a lot of people. Very few people, actually, it's not recorded, many people other than the apostles, did he actually tell them to give up everything, right? So please don't think like this is now every Christian's called to give up everything. No, it was like this is one recorded thing other than the apostles that were called to give up. So know what God is calling you to give up, because there might be something. But whatever God's calling you to give up, remember, like, and I'm going to use this around wealth. God is the one that gave you the ability to create wealth. God is the one who gave you the skills, gave you the opportunities, everything like that to make wealth, first of all. And so if you've done it before, if God's calling you to give it up, he's going to give you've still got the skills and everything to do it again, right? I gave it all up. And I tell you what, when I came back into the marketplace, I stepped straight back in to my same skills of being able to make money, to be able to build business, to be able to teach people, to be able to, but I actually stepped back with a lot more wisdom. I stepped back with a lot more experience. I stepped back with so much better perspective that now I approach things completely differently. And I know that I'm much better at what I do now because of the time that I took with him. Once again, I'm not saying you have to give it up. I'm not saying you have to give everything up, but there's something that God is calling you to give up. And please understand, if you did it before, imagine how much better you could do it afterwards with Christ by your side, with Christ leading you and guiding you. That's my encouragement to you. And I hope that, I kind of feel like that's a good way to end today. When we're talking about money, we spoke about a lot about money. Let's not hold it too tightly. Let's not treat it like it's our God. Remember, we have one God and one God only that sits on the throne over this entire world. And so there's a lot of things that we've spoken about today around money. I hope that you've found it, that it's increased your knowledge, just the general information. We've spoken about some of these situations. As leaders, it is so important that we are knowledgeable about these things, that we are aware of what's happening. Research it. As Dr. Rod said, don't live in fear. Don't live in fear with all these things that are happening around us, but be knowledgeable around these things. Take into account, prepare yourself, prepare your business, make wise decisions, have experts around you, but those experts are not God either as well. So there's been lots of other things. And so if you've enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up, put a comment below if there's been anything that's really spoken to you about any of these things. And if you look, it'd be an absolute honor if you would consider subscribing for more faith-based leadership content. Dr. Rod, once again, thank you so much for joining us again.
As always, a great pleasure.
Bless you guys, and hope you guys learn to live and lead on purpose. Have a great week.